Now we are recording. In January 2009, Shapiro was appointed Senior Director for the Middle East and North Africa of the U.S. National Security Council, focusing on Israel. He attended every Israel-related meeting and met with every senior Israeli diplomat and military officer who visited Washington, D.C. Shapiro often accompanied U.S. Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, George Mitchell, on his trips to the region, and played a central role in talks regarding the Middle East peace process and the strengthening of military cooperation between the U.S. and Israel. He was nominated by President Barack Obama in 2011 and sworn as ambassador to the state of Israel, ambassador of the U.S. to Israel. He maintained close relations with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in spite of tensions between the Israeli Prime Minister and President Obama. As an Obama administration political appointee, Shapiro was ordered in January 2017 to resign upon the inauguration of President Donald Trump. After concluding his service as ambassador to Israel, Shapiro became a distinguished visiting fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University. And he is interviewed in Hebrew and in English on an almost daily basis these days. I hear him all the time on Galei Tzahal and other and TV stations. Dan Shapiro was born to a Jewish family in Champaign, Illinois, one of 4 children of novelist Elizabeth Klein Shapiro and University of Illinois English professor emeritus Michael Shapiro. Shapiro speaks both Hebrew and Arabic, although he's going to speak today in English. He's married to Julie Fisher. The couple has 3 daughters. They are members of the conservative Jewish Aleph Israel congregation in Washington. This was not on Wikipedia. He's also a member of congregation Hod Ve'adar. Our congregation reads Torah, Shaliach Tzibur, and leads the dancing on Simchat Torah endlessly. So with that introduction and these pictures of the Mimuna in the background, if you could relate a little bit to how are you personally holding up these days?
Thank you, Rav Tzvika, and welcome everybody to the Zoom. I do appreciate the Maimuna pictures. You know, my first, well, I was here as a young child with my parents in 1973, but my first experience on my own was during a gap year program in 1987, and I lived with a Moroccan family in Jerusalem, and it was my first exposure to Maimuna. And I became a devoted adherent and fan of that holiday. So it's nice to see these remembrances of celebrating with my Moroccan friends. How are we doing? I think, like everybody, learning to work virtually. Most of my work these days involves a lot of travel, a lot of travel in Israel to deal with the research I'm doing, to deal with the companies I'm advising, traveling to the States to do speaking engagements, and to do political work as well. And all of that obviously is on hold. So I've spent a lot of time on Zoom settings like this one. And it's a challenge to make that as productive as one would want it to be, but that's the situation we're in. The girls are, well, one of our daughters is in the Army. I think most people know that. She is actually a paramedic in training and who has been drafted into a coronavirus testing unit and travels around the country in full protective gear, testing people for the virus. We're obviously very proud of that. Our other 2 daughters are at home and have done some online schooling. That's an adventure in and of itself. But there's also been a lot of good family time as a result. We have movie night every night. And I think the hardest part is the sort of uncertainty about how long these conditions will last. You know, anybody can make an adjustment to a hardship and a change in their routine for a week or 2 weeks or even a month or something if you kind of know that's the defined universe of that problem. But we're facing something that obviously we don't know how long it's going to change our routines. It could be weeks, it could be months, it could come in waves where we start to resume some kind of normal activity and then have to return to these lockdowns or social distancing if there's another outbreak. And that's very hard to adjust to. It's certainly hard to make longer term professional plans, but also all of people's personal lives, vacations, and other family events are upended by it as well. So we're doing fine, but dealing with all of those challenges like everybody on this call and really everybody around the world.
Okay. As someone who's really seen the world, as they say, what is your reaction to how the coronavirus is affecting world economy, health, and the day-to-day political situations in general?
Sure. I'll take each one of those, and they're really quite extraordinary. I mean, it's still very early, of course, to really read the ultimate impacts of this historic event. And I think everybody who writes a detailed analysis of how economies and politics and even health infrastructure will be shaped by this in the years ahead is really guessing. It's a bit too early to know, but I'll say a few things. As far as the economic effects are going, we cannot, I think, overstate the devastation. We will face now in our lifetime, in these next months, a downturn that is certainly going to be the worst global downturn since the Great Depression, and conceivably worse. Almost every economy in the world is going to experience significant negative growth because of almost a complete shutdown of economic activity, at least for this quarter. And there's a lot of scenarios where that extends through much of this year. I think people have seen in Israel the spike in unemployment claims, something like 1 million Israelis, close to a quarter of the workforce in Israel. American unemployment set records by orders of magnitude. 17 million Americans applied for unemployment in 3 weeks. That's again dwarfs any previous application, and there are projections that the unemployment rate in the U.S. could reach 20%, and even somewhere it could reach 30%. And even once we are able to start to pull out of this, it won't be automatic, and the interruption of trade, of manufacturing, of supply chains is going to take a long time to get back to some kind of normal, and some of it will be disrupted in a permanent way. For example, there's a big debate in the United States about needing to ensure that in the future we will be able to source medical equipment from local manufacturing or from domestic manufacturing rather than rely on Chinese or other Asian or other foreign suppliers. And that's just one very obviously relevant example of how the structural aspects of the economy are going to make adjustments that will also have further disruptions even once we begin to pull out of the immediate crisis. So this is huge, and we shouldn't underscore it. I'm sure everybody feels it in some way in their own personal finances as well. As far as the health impacts, I think in some ways we really haven't seen the full effects of it yet. We obviously have in those countries where there have been significant outbreaks, and of course in the developed world, Italy, Spain, and I'm sorry to say the United States have probably really had the worst outbreaks, while other countries have had some more success in managing it. In Scandinavia, in Germany, in New Zealand, and in Asian countries, Singapore and Hong Kong. Probably the numbers that we know out of China and Russia are significantly underreported. And so it seems that we don't yet know the full scale. And of course, there's the issue of people who can carry the virus asymptomatically, and there's the issue of non-universal testing. And so there's probably much more exposure and many more cases than we even know, even where there is recording. And then those countries that have managed it better than others, such as Singapore and Hong Kong, are even now seeing a belated second wave where they're struggling to continue to maintain control. But the real risk, I don't want to say the real risk, the additional risk that we really have not seen yet is if and when this virus hits the developing world in a serious way. If you're talking about a major outbreak in a country like Egypt with the huge overcrowding of a city like Cairo, or Lagos, Nigeria, or Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, or many other countries that really lack health infrastructure in which it's almost impossible to do the kind of social distancing simply because of the density of the population that we're trying to do in our lives, where there isn't anywhere near the capability to conduct mass testing or reporting. You could see the virus really sweep those countries in a way that they simply cannot manage, with dramatic health and economic and political effects, and the possibility of a rebound effect of the virus back into countries that had experienced it in the early wave, like the United States, like Israel. And if a vaccine is still 12 to 18 months away, and even when it is one is established, how it can be manufactured at scale, how it can be equitably distributed, I think we still haven't really grappled with maybe some of the worst aspects of this virus. That's on the health side. And then on a political side, there's quite a range. There are a lot of leaders who, particularly in those countries where it's been managed reasonably well, that have been strengthened by it. And in some ways, their political systems have even proven themselves, and that provides even an additional boost of stability. I'm thinking of countries like Germany, like New Zealand, like Singapore, where the leaders are getting, I think, well-deserved credit for having managed a very difficult situation very competently. Obviously, it's a very different story in the United States, where, number one, I think President Trump and the Trump administration's performance has been very, very poor, very slow, very disorganized. We can talk more about that perhaps. But it's also happening during a highly politicized election season. And so it has immediately become a source of political debate. Some accusing Democrats of wanting to use the virus to hurt Trump, to hurt the economy, to root for more deaths so that he can be held accountable for it, to root for a harsher shutdown so the economy suffers more. Some, obviously, on the Democratic side, making this central to the case against Trump, his management of the crisis. And then there's this tendency in other countries toward an increase in authoritarianism. This often happens during times of crisis. Authoritarianism, it can be maybe too strong a word in some cases, but even in the United States after 9/11, anytime there's a major security or economic or health shock, there's a tendency for people who feel vulnerable to be willing to cede certain freedoms or to provide greater authorities to governments to help manage that. We did that after 9/11 with increased surveillance and security measures in airports and all of these kinds of things. That tendency is always, I think, going to be present in even in democracies when people feel vulnerable. But it can be taken to extremes. Hungary is probably the most prominent example of an extreme case at the moment, where President Orban, who is a democratically elected authoritarian leader, I think that's probably a fair way to describe him, has seized on the opportunity to have Parliament pass a law that allows him to rule by decree without any parliamentary oversight, to cancel elections if he so chooses, to punish critics of his government. And I think we will see those types of initiatives in countries that were trending in more authoritarian directions already anyway. And we could see, particularly when, as I said, when this virus really hits the developing world in a serious way, significant crackdowns and strengthening of strongman type leaders, but also breakups. You could find, this produces revolutionary fervor in countries where there is simply no capability to manage it, and it actually harms a leader's legitimacy who doesn't deliver what the people need. Last thing I'll just say on the political side is that I think we are seeing some of the effect of the virus already is to heighten some pre-existing international trends. One is the rivalry between the United States and China. It was already the case that China was really emerging as the main competitor to the United States for global influence, both economically and political terms, and increasingly in some areas security terms as well, and in technology. That obviously is now heightened as there are accusations of blame against China for the mismanagement of the early wave of the virus, for lying about it, for misreporting it. But then China also trying to step into a role that the United States has traditionally played of international leadership by being a provider of assistance to countries who are in need of equipment, medical equipment to manage it. And the United States is quite absent from that effort. I think another trend that was already present but will probably be heightened is anti-globalization, the sense that countries and people will want to feel that their own economies are self-sufficient and less reliant on trade partners. I mentioned the example of domestic production of medical equipment in the United States, but I think that trend will spread. And then, of course, populism. I mentioned Orban, and there are other populist leaders like Bolsonaro in Brazil and India, and Modi in India, who Trump has a flavor of this as well. Who are able to respond to moments of crisis in ways that tend to increase their popularity and their power. What follows all of this is going to be different. But as I said, I think the early analyses of how the international order and even how domestic politics in particular countries will be affected by it is very hard to read and predict reliably this early in this historic event.
Thank you. You mentioned the elections, and I want to go straight into that, and first start with the Democratic Party. You were part of the Obama administration, and you know the Democratic Party very well. What is your analysis of the outcome of the Democratic primary, the Biden victory over Sanders, and also if you could relate to, if you think there's a real chance for a real unification of sides in the Democratic Party, or is the rift between the camps just too big?
I would draw two main conclusions from the, now I think we can say, outcome of the Democratic primary, which Joe Biden has emerged as the presumptive nominee. One is that there is an overwhelming priority, and it is a unifying priority among Democrats in this election, and that is to defeat Donald Trump. That is to prevent a second term of Donald Trump. And I think that was felt throughout the primaries, even as there were differences on certain policy matters, and some of the debates got contentious around issues like expansion of Medicare or the type of policy that should be pursued to fight climate change. But in essence, the differences between the Democratic candidates were relatively small, even on those important policy matters, compared to the gulf that almost all Democratic voters feel between where they stand and the Trump administration. President Trump, even before coronavirus, I think was widely seen among Democratic voters as a uniquely dangerous figure in American history, in American life, not only simply because of competence and the harshness of his style of political rhetoric, but also because of some real strains on constitutional order and his adherence to the separation of powers and limits of presidential power, and certainly how those would be expressed in the second term. So I think there is that overwhelming sense of unity of purpose among Democrats, and that was present in the that was, I think, a theme that ran throughout the primaries. Having said that, the other conclusion, of course, is that there are differences within the party, but I would say that it's pretty clear that the party has not been taken over wholesale by its most progressive faction. Those are important voices, the progressive faction, and particularly strong among younger voters. And there's some prominent new members of Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, from New York, who have given voice to that agenda. And of course, most of those voters were in Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren's camp in the primary. So they're important voices, and they do have influence on the agenda. And you can even see that in some of the adjustments Vice President Biden is beginning to make to his platform in terms of talking about free community college tuition, relief of student debt, expanding Medicare, or at least lowering the age of eligibility for Medicare. These are all influenced by this progressive faction. But having said that, it was pretty clear by the time the voting began in January, that Bernie Sanders' path to the nomination was a path that he could almost only succeed with less than a majority, which is to say he needed a large field. He needed to win, as Donald Trump did in his primary in 2016, he needed to win about 30 or 35% of the Democratic vote, and he had support of a base around that size. But he didn't really have a strategy to get to 50%. And so as long as there were 6 or 8 or 7 or 6 or 8 or 10 other candidates in the field dividing up the rest of the Democratic vote, he had a chance to emerge as the nominee. But as soon as the field narrowed, and it narrowed very, very quickly, much more quickly than expected, after the South Carolina primary, which Vice President Biden won handily, a significant majority coalesced around Vice President Biden, and particularly among African Americans. And that suggests to me that the base of the party, or the bulk of the party, you could say the critical mass of the party, remains in the more moderate camp, not in quite the same place as the most progressive faction that was really the base of Sanders' support. Now, as your question about whether those different factions can unify, that's going to be a critical question in the general election. This week has been a very good week in terms of showing strong indications of unity. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren both have come out with strong, warm, sincere endorsements of Joe Biden, have said they will work hard for his election, have said his election is a critical, that it's critical that Trump be defeated, and they will throw everything they have at helping Biden do that. Biden has invited advisors from the Sanders campaign and the Warren campaign and other campaigns to participate in his policy teams. So it's been a strong week in terms of showing unity among the party. But there's work to do. Biden definitely still has work to do to show those progressives who were really more in the Sanders and Warren camp that he is listening. There is work to do to increase the enthusiasm for Biden among younger voters. Particularly, that was a demographic he did not perform as well with in the primaries, and were much more in the Sanders and Warren wing. And those are voters who are also less reliable voters. They don't necessarily show up every election, and so for him to generate the enthusiasm among them, perhaps partly by who he will pick as his vice presidential running mate, is going to be very important. And then it will be up to all of those leaders together to emphasize for those who didn't support Biden in the primary and maybe think of him as not their cup of tea ideologically, what the true choice is. The true choice is 4 more years of Trump, or a Democratic administration in which prominent progressive leaders have a voice, at least have their voices heard. And I'll say this as someone who has a rooting interest. Hopefully, that unity will prevail through the general election.
Mm-hmm. There's a question I just got in the chat. There has been in Hebrew newspapers, maybe also in English, allegations of sexual harassment and assault that were made regarding Joe Biden. Do you think that will have any impact? Have you heard of it? Do you think that will have any impact?
I've heard of it. I think the New York Times wrote a story about this allegation earlier in the week. A woman who apparently worked on Senator Biden's staff or one of the committees he was on 20 some years ago has made this allegation recently on a podcast. It's new. As far as I know, nothing like this has ever been alleged about Vice President Biden before. I have absolutely no reason to believe it's true, but I can't say I know any details of the allegation. I haven't even read the articles. I've just sort of seen a little bit of secondary coverage that this exists. I'm sure at some point he will be asked about it. I'm sure at some point he will state clearly what the facts are, and I fully expect that as a total denial. And I think it's important always that people who make these who make these allegations have their voices heard and be listened to, and then people try to understand what the facts are. Obviously, there's numerous allegations of that nature regarding President Trump as well. He's, of course, always denied them. My expectation is this is not going to be a main subject of the election, and that it will be run on big national issues. But obviously, when something like that is voiced, the candidate will address it at the appropriate time.
Thanks. I want to move to the general election now. What do you see as the main issues and prospects in the general elections of Trump versus Biden? Obviously, you'll relate to how the coronavirus will affect the campaign. And if you could obviously relate also to the main issues of the corona and even technicalities. There's even a question coming up here in the chat. If you think that there's a risk that the elections will somehow be postponed by Trump on account of the virus.
I think before coronavirus emerged, what Vice President Biden had hoped to make as the main theme of the election really was, as he has often described it, the soul of America, and the kind of leadership that the country needs to handle the big challenges it faces, as well as to do it in a way that unifies rather than deepens the divides between us. Now, there are elements of that in specific issues around healthcare, around the expansion of healthcare availability and affordability, around how the country addresses climate change, on ending the scourge of gun violence, on restoring American leadership internationally, which has suffered a lot as President Trump has pursued his America First policy and really denigrated our alliances and even the allies themselves, on immigration and finding a kind of humane way of addressing our immigration concerns. But I think Vice President Biden had hoped to run an election that would address each of those issues, but try to do it from the perspective of let's find unifying solutions and let's conduct our politics in a way that reflects the soul of America that he believes has been harmed in the way President Trump has conducted politics. And President Trump, I think his hope was to run on a strong economy. Whatever else one can say about President Trump, the economy until coronavirus had performed very well during his presidency. Much of that is a continuation of the growth and the recovery that began in the Obama administration, but obviously happened on his watch. And I think that was very much going to be the centerpiece of his campaign, in addition to the very divisive grievance kind of politics that he practices. But I do think the emergence of coronavirus has changed the nature of the campaign, in the sense that will be the dominant issue almost every day and every night on the news, and almost entirely the basis on which the main public will be making their judgments about who they want to have as president for the next 4 years. And that comes not so much to maybe the specific issues of managing the virus and its after effects, but more to the broader themes of leadership, of preparedness, of competence, of governance, of knowing how to use the tools of government, of crisis management, and then planning for who has an ability to plan for the next phase, to expand testing, to scale it so that we really are able to track any additional outbreaks and contain them, to ensure hospitals and the whole medical care infrastructure has the equipment and has the resources it needs to deal with spikes in outbreaks. And then, of course, a plan for the recovery phase, both the economic recovery phase as well as the phase of prevention and preparedness for future pandemic outbreaks, whether it's coronavirus or something else. Who among the candidates has a plan for economic recovery that will address people's immediate pain and then get the economy back on its feet and functioning again, and in the process try to address some of the inequalities in the system that even pre-existed coronavirus. Those I think are going to be the main issues of the campaign. Certainly, how I think Vice President Biden will frame the debate, and even to some degree how President Trump will frame it. He holds almost a daily news conference these days with with the Vice President and with others on his coronavirus task force, and one of his main purposes, it seems to be, in that news conference is to not necessarily brief the public on the facts of the virus and its status, but to tout his administration's achievements and to take credit for what he can take credit for and deflect blame in other directions, whether it's toward the media, whether it's toward Democrats, whether it's towards China, whether it's toward the World Health Organization, which yesterday he announced the U.S. would withhold funding from, to find other ways of deflecting people's concerns and blame for the virus. So I do think that's going to really dominate the campaign for the rest of the year. Now, in terms of the technicalities, there's no question that coronavirus and the current lockdown or social distancing restrictions that the country faces is going to have a dramatic impact on how the campaign is conducted. At the moment, almost every remaining state that has a primary has postponed that primary and is trying to shift to a much more vote by mail or absentee voting to prevent the need for poll workers and voters to actually have to show up and cast their votes. We just saw in Wisconsin the primary that was not postponed just last week, people having to stand in line for hours because there were a reduced number of polling sites, because fewer poll workers showed up, having to stand in the bad weather with masks on at 6 feet social distancing. Really an absurd way to try to conduct an election. So already we have seen that effect. Now it's less maybe important since Sanders has suspended his campaign. We know the outcome of the primaries. Maybe fewer people would come to vote for those primaries anyway, but it's already had some disruptive effect on voting. But it certainly has a major effect on how the campaign is actually conducted. Right now, Vice President Biden, like most people, is staying home. He isn't traveling. He isn't going around and meeting voters. He isn't conducting events and rallies and spending time in the swing states that will really decide the general election. He is mostly conducting the campaign from his home, from a sort of a studio that has been constructed in his basement. And that's obviously a very limiting way to have the kind of impact on voters that a candidate traditionally tries to have. President Trump, too, he has the Rose Garden and he has the White House briefing room. Those are good backdrops for his news conferences, but he's not traveling. He's not holding the kinds of rallies that he likes to hold. So he also has essentially suspended the campaign. The offices of both campaigns are essentially shuttered, and people are working from home, which has its limiting effect. And we have no idea whatsoever whether anything like a convention, a traditional party convention, will be able to be held. The Democratic convention has already been postponed from July until August. The Republican convention was already scheduled for August. But I think it's highly unlikely, although I don't think we know yet, but it's certainly highly possible that by August it will not be reasonable to hold a convention of tens of thousands of people gathered in an arena over several days, and that even if the parties wanted to do it, that the local officials in, I guess, Wisconsin and North Carolina would permit it. So it's very likely that conventions will not occur as they have traditionally done. It's very likely that campaigning will not occur even through the fall as it's traditionally done. And then there's the big question of how the voting will take place. The Democratic members of Congress have said in the next relief bill that passes, they will try to include a significant increase in funding to help states shift to all vote by mail or no excuse absentee balloting, meaning anybody can request an absentee ballot without needing to prove that they would be out of the state on the election day. Many states have that, but other states do not. There was a smallish, I don't want to say small, but there was a sort of a down payment toward that in the most recent coronavirus relief bill of about $400 million. But the estimates are that it would really take about $4 billion to enable all states to get that infrastructure for vote by mail in place. But that's also going to encounter resistance, as it did in Wisconsin, from a number of legislatures, particularly the Republican-held controlled legislatures, where vote by mail is seen in some cases as a way of expanding opportunities to vote for populations that tend to vote more for Democrats, for minority populations, for other populations that don't turn out at the polls as frequently. President Trump himself has disparaged the use of vote by mail as a kind of an open invitation to corruption. There's no statistical evidence that backs that assertion, and he himself has been a beneficiary of vote by mail in most recent elections. But he is making that claim, and some other Republican governors and state officials are starting to repeat it. But it's really becoming a critical question. If we are unable to conduct elections in November the way we are accustomed to doing it, with people showing up at the polls in states that don't have a lot of early voting or a lot of voting by mail opportunities, you could have these very, very chaotic scenes, as the ones like the ones we saw in Wisconsin. And that could produce some disputed outcomes about whether dates should be extended for the filing of ballots. That happened in the Wisconsin case, about who is eligible to vote on an absentee basis, and of course in a close run election and in several key swing states, that could throw the whole national election into dispute about what the actual outcome is. There is no real provision for the election to be postponed. It's not something within President Trump's authority. It's in law that the election, or it's even in the Constitution, that the election is held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. It would require an act of Congress to postpone it, and that's never happened in all of American history. I don't see any chance it will happen this year, but there's a lot of reason for worry that if there aren't clear and sort of predictable and agreed voting procedures, that there could be a lot of disputes about counts and about outcomes, and so perhaps sufficient to scramble the outcome and make it disputed. And then we'd have a very painful November and December and January while that got sorted out on a state-by-state recount basis and undoubtedly through multiple court cases before we might know the actual winner of the election.
Regarding Joe Biden, what would be your preferred vice president for Biden? I mean, probably you don't want to name anyone, but the characteristics. It's one of the questions asked in the chat. If you're willing to really.
Sure. Well, the vice president's already said he plans to choose a woman as his vice presidential running mate, and there are, as he has also said, numerous women who are qualified to be president immediately. That I think should be the first criteria, that the person he chooses should be able to step in as president on day one, and that's not only because Vice President Biden would be on the older side, or I guess the oldest president to ever take office, but that should be true all the time for any vice president, that they really have that experience and gravitas that they could step into that role. And there are numerous people who fill it. There's a lot of people who place emphasis on an African-American running mate, particularly because African-American voters were so central to Biden's recovery and win, first in South Carolina and then across numerous other states and Super Tuesday and beyond. and there are some prominent and impressive African-American women. Kamala Harris of California, Stacey Abrams of Georgia come to mind. Val Demings, a congresswoman from Orlando, Florida. So there are numerous opportunities there. There are people who suggest that if he were trying to reach out and create that sort of unity ticket with the progressive wing of the party, that Elizabeth Warren would make a strong running mate, and undoubtedly she would. She was very impressive in the primaries, clearly qualified and full of detailed policy ideas and a lot of sort of savvy about how to implement them. That would be a strong asset as a running mate and as a vice president. There are others who say that, you know, in the previous election, the swing states that had they swung the other way for Hillary Clinton, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, those should be the focus. And so an upper Midwesterner, or somebody who is sort of culturally attuned to those states, someone like Amy Klobuchar, the senator from Minnesota, who ran impressively in her presidential campaign, would be a strong candidate. So those are some of the names that are floated. I think the campaign needs to do what campaigns do. It needs to do a full vetting of all the serious candidates, all their background, all their abilities, anything that would emerge in the course of the campaign. I think they need to do the kind of polling to understand, you know, which of these types of candidates would deliver the most, whether it's boosting enthusiasm among young voters, among progressive voters, among African-American voters, among moderate swing voters, people who voted for Obama in 2012, but then voted for Trump in 2016, and we need to get back into the Democratic camp. Those are all things that can be polled and tested. So I think there are numerous, good options, and beyond even the names I've mentioned. The campaign will take its time and do its research, and obviously then it will also come down to the personal chemistry and the personal comfort level of Vice President Biden with whoever in the end he selects. So I'm not making a pick, but I'm describing, I think, some of the factors that the campaign will consider as they make the decision.
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of questions in the chat about the elections. We'll come back to that, I hope, if we have remaining time. But I want to go back to the coronavirus and the Jewish community in America. The following is, I think, from the New York Times. Rockland County, New York, has the highest per capita rate of infection in New York State. And local authorities have been waging and losing battle to curb the coronavirus outbreak. The source of the problem lies in small pockets of the county that are home to a large number of Orthodox Jewish residents, some of whom, according to authorities, have refused to adhere to social distancing requirements. Again, I think this is from the New York Times. How is this all viewed by the non-Jewish population in the U.S., and will this have any fallout on the relations with the Jewish community as a whole?
There was actually a terrific article on this subject in the Forward just a few days ago, written by Jody Rudoran. Some of you probably remember Jody. She was the New York Times bureau chief in Jerusalem for several years until about 2014 or 15, and went back to the Times, and then has more recently moved to the Forward as the editor-in-chief. And she wrote a really quite interesting piece about tensions within the Jewish community surrounding the coronavirus outbreak, and particularly the what seemed to be large outbreaks in the ultra-Orthodox community. So there are two issues. One, obviously, is there an increase in anti-Semitic attitudes and views that are connected with that outbreak? And then the second is there increase in tension within the Jewish community between the ultra-Orthodox and the more liberal, Reform conservative, non-Orthodox wings of the community. There have been, of course, there has been a rise in anti-Semitic rhetoric surrounding coronavirus, although I don't think so much connected to that outbreak as some of the kind of traditional ugliness that you hear in any time of crisis, or that we have heard in related to past outbreaks of disease, that Jews are somehow responsible for it, are behind it, are using it to gain some kind of influence or gain some kind of control. So some of that exists, but I don't think I trace it directly to this large outbreak in those communities. There, of course, and it's something that's somewhat similar to what has happened in Israel, where some Haredi communities were slower to adopt social distancing restrictions, were maybe less aware or less trustful of the instructions that they were getting from national authorities, were maybe getting conflicting instructions or advice from their more proximate local and rabbinical leaders. They, because of the slowness to take up the social distancing requirements, that has probably contributed to the outbreak in those communities. At the same time, those are also communities frequently where there is significant poverty, significant density and overcrowding, and there's actually difficulty in achieving the social distancing, as has been also true in non-Jewish communities that suffer from the same kind of physical restrictions. So to the degree that people are sort of turning to those communities and the outbreaks in them and saying, look, they're responsible for that, and they are therefore responsible for perpetuating or extending the life of the virus and a broader spread of the virus, there's perhaps some legitimate criticism toward leaders who have not properly prepared their communities. And there's also a certain degree of blaming the victim, where people who certainly would have wanted to do what was necessary to avoid getting sick or to avoid doing anything that spreads the virus have found it very difficult to be able to do that. I do worry about a kind of reduced solidarity within the Jewish community because of some of these themes. And this is what Jody really wrote about, that the non-Orthodox Jews have voiced a certain degree of criticism and judgment, and in some cases sort of a kind of a shame about the spread of the virus in ultra-Orthodox communities, have not shown sympathy for what those communities have experienced. And that's a shift from what really had seemed to be an increase in solidarity and sympathy after the highlighting the outbreaks of violence against ultra-Orthodox Jews in Crown Heights and in Muncie and in Jersey City that were happening over the last year or so. And it took a while, but as in the December or January, I forget which, there was a kind of a unity march of Jews for representing a wide spectrum of communities in support of Jews who had experienced that kind of violence, even if they were not themselves members of those communities. So I think it's really important that we learn not to tar entire communities with the brush of blame, where there's room for criticism, particularly of leaders who have been slow to really counsel their flocks on how to be most attentive to the restrictions and to preventing the spread of the virus. That criticism is legitimate, but it's important also to come with the expectation of responsibility, the expression of sympathy for people who have been caught in circumstances beyond their control. And that last point is just, that question of not tarring entire communities with own brush, I think is also critically important. There's a different example outside the Jewish community where the president of Liberty University, this is the evangelical university in Virginia, who is Jerry Falwell Jr., has made a big show of refusing to close his university and refusing to shift to fully online learning, as almost every other university in the country has done, because of what seems to be a political agenda to support President Trump's desire to reopen the economy, to show that coronavirus is not as serious as some of the critics are saying. And unfortunately, it has resulted in an outbreak of the virus on his campus and contributed to an outbreak in the community in which that campus is located in, I want to say, Blacksburg, Virginia. Obviously, that sounds like a very irresponsible act on the part of that university president and leadership. But I don't think we should draw conclusions or tar the entire evangelical community as a result of it, either on the campus or more broadly. So I think it's important to place responsibility where it lies, but be very cautious about broad characterizations and ensure that there is sympathy and support for people who have found themselves caught up in these situations.
Okay, thank you. Dan, let's go to the questions from people. If you can open the chat box, you can see different questions there. There's some that I received privately. One is from Aaron Leitner, who's asking, there have been a lot of articles coming out about the impact of Corona on the capabilities of Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. What is your view, short-term and long-term?
Iran has one of the worst coronavirus outbreaks in the world, and its own leadership has been, number one, very opaque about the spread of it. It's probably much worse than the official numbers, and has also been impacted by it. A number of Iranian leaders themselves, parliamentarians and other officials, have actually been sickened, and some have died by the virus. And it, there is the question of whether or not this virus, because it's been so poorly handled by that leadership, could in fact weaken their control over the country. The country was already suffering a severe economic strain because of the U.S. sanctions. There are those who have hoped, both among Iranian opposition groups and some outside, and who are opponents and critics of the Iranian government, which I certainly am one of them, that even that pre-virus economic strain might have the effect of leading the Iranian people to replace their government somehow. So far, that hasn't happened, and there's there's always the push and pull in a situation like this, where people may feel dissatisfied by their own leadership's management of the crisis, and yet still depends on that leadership to provide them with the assistance, the medical care, the need to have their needs met. So I don't think we should assume that the government's going to fall over the coronavirus, but it certainly has added to the stresses they've been under. That's coincided, of course, with the economic downturn that has produced an even lower oil price than existed before, which further weakens the Iranian economy. So I think Iran is quite weakened by this virus and the attendant economic impact. That doesn't mean it won't still apply resources to moving weapons into Syria and threatening Israel that way, or to harassing American ships in the Gulf, as happened yesterday with some Iranian small craft, that led to some dangerous encounters between Iranian ships. And their sponsorship of terrorist organizations is so central to that regime's ideology that it seems that that will continue no matter how stressed their economy is. But it may produce some limits on how much they can devote, how much resources they can devote to that. Hezbollah itself has suffered some spread of the virus, in part because of the connections with Iran that travel back and forth between Iran and Syria, and Iran and Lebanon. It's but Hezbollah was already in a fairly dominant position in Lebanon. Not that Lebanon is particularly functional, but there's no power stronger than Hezbollah in Lebanon, and I think it's likely that's going to continue to be the case because the Lebanese government is also struggling with the economic fallout of this, and Hezbollah has its own source of revenue from Iran that the Lebanese government does not have. Hamas is an interesting case because Gaza initially appeared somewhat isolated from the coronavirus. It's so closed off that it took longer to take hold there than it did in other parts of the world. Maybe one of the few benefits of living in Gaza, where conditions are obviously very, very poor. But it eventually did arrive, as it certainly was not possible to keep it out forever. Hamas authorities have set up some quarantine camps and tried to limit its spread. Obviously, Gaza is one of those places where if it starts to spread widely in the community, it's going to be very, very hard to control because the density of the population and the substandard health infrastructure makes that very, very likely that it would spread quite dramatically. So far, it seems that the numbers that we know of are still fairly modest, and there has been provision of medical equipment, testing equipment, protection equipment for hospitals, hospital workers provided even through or by the Israeli authorities. The UN Special Representative Nikolai Mladenov actually about 2 weeks ago gave strong praise and encouragement to the cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority and Israel and Hamas for trying to treat this as a public health emergency, not as an issue, another issue that should be pulled under by the political tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. It's not perfect, but I do think the management of that crisis has been better between Israelis and Palestinians, including with Hamas, than might have been expected. But obviously, the risk of it getting out of control in Gaza is large. That's not a risk Israel can ignore either, because these viruses really don't respect borders. But it has, I think, kept the focus off of the more traditional forms of conflict. There have been 1 or 2 rockets fired during this period, but it's been fairly quiet in the south. There haven't been demonstrations at the fence in quite some time, in part, I think, to prevent crowds gathering in Gaza. So for now, for better or worse, it seems to have had a dampening effect on the Israel-Hamas conflict.
Thank you. If you have the chat open there, and you want to choose, one of the questions to respond to, and if you spoke about, Hamas and our region, maybe relate to also the elections in America and its impact on Israel, especially, given Biden's position towards Israel versus Trump, who's seen by many Israelis as very supportive of Israel, and how do you relate to that? And, if you could look at also some of the questions.
Sure. So I guess one question is, how will Israel play out in the U.S. election? And I have to say, I think it will be a fairly minor issue in the election as a whole. As I mentioned, the election obviously is going to be dominated by coronavirus-related matters, the management of the crisis, the recovery from the health and economic effects of the crisis. Who has a plan? Who shows the leadership? Who shows the competence? I think that's going to certainly be the dominant theme of the election overall. Foreign policy generally will be less important in this campaign than it might have been in others, although that question about American leadership and whether the United States will, particularly in the coronavirus story, step forward as a global leader to help prevent a second wave, to help distribute vaccines, to help other countries manage it, to work with allies, or pull inward and kind of reinforce the sort of America First, high wall attitude that Trump has articulated. That may be a sub-theme of the coronavirus story in the campaign, but even that, I think, is secondary in terms of what people will focus on. As for Israel, it is true, of course, that there are those who see President Trump as having been strongly supportive of Israel, and of course he has been supportive, and some of the specific things he's done, moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and canceling the Iran nuclear deal and recognizing Israel's sovereignty in the Golan Heights, have support in certain segments of the Jewish community, but it has not significantly changed his approval rating among Jewish voters. It still is quite low. I think there's still every expectation, even among Republicans, that a Democratic candidate, this was true even before we knew who the Democratic candidate would be, would get the traditional 65 to 75% of Jewish voters. Vice President Biden is certainly seen widely and correctly as someone with long, deep, personal, emotional connections to Israel, someone who has fought throughout his career for Israel's legitimacy, for its security, for the U.S. to increase Israel's U.S. support for both of those. Certainly someone who had a strong hand in the negotiation of the $38 billion assistance package and the provision of assistance for Iron Dome that happened during the Obama administration. There will obviously be those who will raise the controversies of the Obama administration, whether it's around the Iran deal or whether around the vote in the UN Security Council at the end in December of 2016, and try to tie those to Biden. But Biden's own strong and deep ties in the Jewish community and with Israeli leaders, including his, frankly, quite decades-long friendship and productive working relationship with Netanyahu, I think are going to be a strong cushion on the ability to use that as a major attack line against him. I would also say that there are many Jewish voters who think that President Trump's attitudes on Israel, and particularly the plan he released, which could at some point this year lead Israel to begin to unilaterally annex large portions of the West Bank, are very harmful for Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state and the prospects for a two-state solution. So I'm not even sure that Trump really benefits fully, even in the Jewish community, from those policies. Now, in a close election in a swing state with a lot of Jewish voters, like Florida, like Pennsylvania, like Ohio, maybe Michigan, slightly smaller numbers, every vote counts. And if the shift from the 75% that Obama, or he actually got 78% in his election in 2008, went to 70 or even to 65%. That's not an insignificant number of votes. It's tens of thousands of votes in Florida. It's maybe 10 to 20,000 votes in Pennsylvania or Ohio. That's legitimate, something to think about, whether it could have an impact. But I think if either campaign thinks that's going to be the main issue, you never leave anything to chance. Every vote matters. But if either campaign thinks that's going to be a main subject of the campaign, I think that's incorrect. It will be something dealt with really at the margins, and sometimes the margins can matter.
Okay, thanks. So we'll continue. Last question you'll pick from the chat. Okay, so if you could go over it and then pick the last question.
Looking. Yeah, well, I guess it just came up yesterday, this question of cutting off funding from the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization is the only organization that has the reach and the capability to provide information and assistance, especially into less developed countries really that don't have the healthcare infrastructure they need to fight the virus. And the United States is, as it is for most international organizations, the largest provider of funding. I think it's about $400 million, which is generally about 25% of the budget of any international organization. Now, the World Health Organization is not by any means a perfect actor. Many international organizations are bloated and are inefficient and have those kinds of challenges. And many of them also have been politicized. The World Health Organization in particular has received also a lot of funding from China, and China uses that funding to try to influence its conduct and its agenda to shield itself from criticism, I think quite justified criticism, for its own management of the virus, to prevent Taiwan, China's rival, from joining the World Health Organization. And Taiwan actually has been maybe perhaps the most successful country in the world in terms of its management of the coronavirus crisis so far. So it really has a lot to teach and a lot to share with the world, and the World Health Organization should be a forum to take Taiwanese successes and bring them around the world, and China helps prevent that. So there's a lot of reason for criticism of the World Health Organization. But at the same time, for the United States, at a moment of really critical kind of inflection point of trying to prevent the virus from getting a second wave or getting out of control in developing countries, which will obviously devastate those countries, but also almost certainly lead to a second wave back in our country and in northern countries, let's say, is just a highly irresponsible act. I'm not sure the Trump administration is even going to go through with it. Frequently, President Trump will make these kinds of announcements. He will use it to stir up some grievance and anger against his target as part of his blame deflection strategy, but then not follow through on it. In fact, the day after he said it, the Centers for Disease Control and the U.S. Agency for International Development, these are among the partner organizations within the U.S. government for the World Health Organization, they didn't have anything to say to back up the idea that the U.S. was going to stop cooperating with the WHO. And I hope it will not actually happen. But I do think it's indicative of the attitude that President Trump and his administration brings to international crises generally, and to this one, and that Vice President Biden is going to challenge very strongly and certainly would do differently. You can take a similar look at how President Trump has dealt with the issue of climate change. He came in with an international convention, the Paris Climate Accords, not a perfect agreement by any means, but certainly one that created targets and some ability to share technologies and best practices among countries to try to lower greenhouse gas emissions with targets that would slow the warming of the climate. And he almost immediately withdrew from that agreement. Not only did he withdraw from that agreement and indicate that the United States would no longer be the leader of this, what should be an international effort, he ceded that ground to China. China is actually now which has much culpability for the pollution of the planet that has produced the warming climate, but is now seen by many as the leader in the effort to change direction, to control that, to spread technologies that will help fight climate change. And the United States is quite absent from it. President Trump more generally has alienated and disparaged allies and alliances like NATO and our European and Asian partners. When the United States takes that attitude that it's all about America first, that we solve our problems disconnected from the rest of the world, that we are insensitive or uncaring or just even unwilling in a practical way to cooperate with other nations to address problems that really can't be addressed only within our borders, whether it's climate, whether it's pandemics, whether it's migration of refugees, or whether it's economic and trade challenges. We really hurt ourselves. But again, in times of stress, whether it's economic stress, technology change, migration, pandemics, sometimes that sort of populism sells. I think it's a contributing factor to why Trump was elected in the first place. It's certainly contributing a factor to why he has this hard base of support of 35 to 40% of the country that finds that to be actually an appealing way of addressing the U.S. position in the world. I don't think it's where the majority of Americans are, but it's going to be an important element of the theme of leadership. When there's a crisis like this, not only how do you manage the U.S. government response and help protect American people, but how do you use U.S. leadership internationally to help other countries, but help other countries in our own self-interest to prevent their economies from collapsing, to prevent the spread of the virus that will ultimately come back to us again, to ensure that we as a global community are better prepared to prevent and manage future outbreaks than we were for this one.
Thank you so much, former Ambassador Dan Shapiro, for this really fascinating discussion.